I know this is going to sound crazy, I really do, but the first time I heard my dead wife's voice, it was coming from something that looked like an owl. Emily passed away a year ago. I finally started to accept that she was gone. It wasn't easy, but I was finally getting there. Then, one afternoon, I heard her call my name out in the backyard, exactly the way she always used to. She sounded calm, and I remember it so well because it was the same way she'd sound whenever she needed my help with something. I remember thinking, there's no way. There's just no way. So I walk out my back door to my yard, and I have no idea what I'm going to see out there. I mean, how do you even prepare yourself for something like that? Then I look at the oak tree that we planted together, and there's something that looked like a giant owl. I mean, this thing was huge, like 6 feet tall, but there's no way. At that point, I'm thinking, this isn't an owl. This is something else trying to look like an owl. I didn't even know what the hell was going on. Then, it's just there, perfectly still. This thing isn't moving, but I hear it speaking, and it sounds just like Emily. I swear. It says, honey, can you come out here for a second? That's when I realized this wasn't grief. I wasn't imagining things. I was being hunted by something evil. Emily had been gone for almost exactly a year when all of this happened. She got sick pretty fast. I don't really want to get into too much of that, but it was cancer. And by the time they found it, there wasn't much they could do. We were married for 18 years, and when you've been with somebody for that long, they're just everywhere. Even when they're not there anymore, they're still everywhere. Her coffee mug was still in the cabinet. Her coat was still hanging near the front door. There were little notes she wrote stuck inside the drawers. I found one in the kitchen a few months after she died that just said, don't forget milk. That one destroyed me. I don't know why. Out of everything, that stupid little note. Anyway, I sat on the kitchen floor holding it for almost an hour. But after a year, I was doing a little bit better. I was sleeping again. I was going to work. I wasn't talking to her picture every night anymore. I still missed her, of course I did, but I was finally starting to accept that she wasn't coming back. And then I heard her voice. It was around 4 in the afternoon, broad daylight. That's important because I wasn't half asleep and it wasn't dark outside. I was standing in the kitchen, washing some dishes, when I heard her say my name. David? I stopped right there. I mean, I completely stopped. The water was still running. I was holding a dish under the faucet, and I just stood there listening. Then I heard it again. David, can you come out here for a second? It was her. I know people are going to say grief can make you hear things, and I understand that. I thought the same thing, but I knew Emily's voice. I knew every little part of it. I knew how she'd say my name when she was annoyed with me. I knew how she'd say my name when she was half asleep. I knew how she'd say my name when she needed help with something outside. And this was exactly that voice. Calm and normal, like it was just right outside waiting for me. I walked toward the back door, but I didn't open it right away. I looked out the glass. At first, I didn't see anything. The yard looked completely normal. The sun was out, there were a few leaves moving around. The neighbor's dog was barking, somewhere probably down the street, but nothing looked wrong. Then I looked towards the oak tree, and standing right next to it was that thing. It looked like an owl, at least part of it did. It had feathers, it had wings folded against its body. It had a round owl head, but it was way too big. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing looked almost as tall as me, maybe even taller. It was standing upright near the tree, and it wasn't moving at all. I opened the door just a little bit. I stepped onto the back patio, and that thing didn't move. It just watched me. I said, Emily? The second I said her name, I knew I shouldn't have. I felt it immediately. Something about that whole yard changed. Everything got quiet. Even the neighbor's dog stopped barking. The leaves stopped moving. Even the air felt different. It didn't open its beak. It didn't move its head. Nothing on the body moved. I backed up. I remember saying no. I don't even know who I was saying it to. Maybe the owl, maybe myself. I just kept saying no, no. Then I got back inside and I slammed the door. I locked it. I pulled the curtains shut. Then I went through the whole house and checked every window. I must have checked the back door 5 times. After that, I sat down on the couch and I tried to figure out what the hell just happened. I spent the rest of that day convincing myself that I was losing my mind. That's really what I thought. I didn't think there's a monster in the backyard. I thought something is wrong with me. I had not been sleeping great. Maybe I was more upset about the anniversary of Emily's death than I realized. Maybe I was having some kind of a breakdown. I looked up grief hallucinations on my phone. Apparently people do hear the voices of people they've lost. Sometimes they even see them. So I told myself that's what happened. There was probably a normal owl near a tree, and my mind made it look bigger than it really was. Then I imagined Emily's voice. That had to be it. I kept repeating that to myself all afternoon, but I didn't open the curtains again, not once. When it started getting dark, I turned on every light in the house. I wasn't even trying to hide that I was scared, because I was terrified. I made coffee even though it was late and I knew I wasn't going to sleep. Around 10 o'clock, I was sitting in the living room with the television on. I wasn't watching it, I just wanted the noise in the house. Then I heard something hit the roof. Not hard, kind of a heavy thump. I muted the television, nothing. Then I heard it again, closer to the back of the house, that same thump. Then something started scratching across the roof. It sounded like its claws were dragging over the shingles. I just sat there frozen. The scratching stopped right over the living room. Then I heard Emily's voice again. "David?" This time it was coming from the outside front window. I didn't answer. "David, where are you?" At that point, I just started crying. And I'm not embarrassed to say that. I completely lost it. I covered my ears, but I could still hear her. "Honey, come outside." It sounded exactly like she did during the last few weeks before she died. Weak and tired, like she needed me. That was the cruelest part. Whatever this thing was, it knew how to make me feel guilty. It knew how to make me think she was suffering. Then the voice moved. 1 second it was outside the front window, then it was near the side of the house, then the next second it was right outside the back door. "David, please." I don't know what came over me. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real. Maybe I was angry. I got up and I walked towards the kitchen. I grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet. Then I went to the back door and I pulled the curtain aside. The owl was standing in the middle of the yard. Same size, same place near that tree, except now it was dark and I could barely make out the shape of it. I turned on the patio light, and the second the light came on, its eyes opened. They were red, not reflecting red, glowing red, like there was a light behind them. I opened the door just a few inches, and I said, "What do you want?" The thing tilted its head. That was the first time I'd seen it move. Then it said in Emily's voice, "Come closer." At that point, I just slammed the door. And the second I did, something hit it from the other side. The whole door shook. I jumped back, then it hit the door again, harder, and the glass rattled. I backed into the kitchen holding the bat. Then, everything stopped. No scratching, no voice, nothing. I waited maybe 30 seconds. Then I looked through the glass. The yard was empty. I should have stayed inside, I know that now, but I opened the door. I stepped out onto that patio, and I looked towards that tree. There was nothing there. Then I heard huge wings above me, huge wings, not like a normal bird. It sounded like somebody shaking a heavy blanket right over my head. I looked up and that thing was coming straight at me. Its wings were spread out almost the width of the yard, and as it got closer, I saw its face, and it didn't have an owl's face anymore. I don't even know what it had. It looked kind of human and kind of animal at the same time, but the mouth was too wide. The skin around its eyes looked stretched, and those eyes were staring straight at me. I dropped the bat and I ran back inside and I slammed the door. I saw its face for maybe a half a second on the other side of the glass. Then it was gone. I locked the door and I fell backwards onto the floor. I stayed there for a long time. I was hysterical. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold my phone. I thought I was going crazy. I really did. Because there were only two possibilities. Either some kind of a giant creature had just tried to get inside my house, or my mind had finally broken. I honestly didn't know which one scared me more. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I started to close my eyes, I saw that thing's face. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Emily calling me again. This time the voice was farther away, out near the tree line. David. Then a few minutes later, it was closer. Then, right outside the kitchen, it said, "Come out here." I sat on the living room floor with every light on, holding that baseball bat. I kept telling myself not to answer. I thought if I answered, it would know exactly where I was in the house. I know that doesn't make sense. It already knew I was in the house, but by then, I wasn't even thinking clearly. When the sun finally came up, the voice stopped. I didn't feel better though. I was afraid to go outside. I didn't go to work. I called in sick and I kept every door locked. Around noon, I started thinking maybe the daylight would make me feel safer. So I opened one curtain, just a little, and I looked out into the yard. There was nothing around there. Everything looked normal again. I almost laughed. I thought, see, you lost your mind last night. That's all it is. But then I looked past the fence. Behind the house, there's a narrow line of trees. Not really woods, just enough trees and brush to separate the houses from an old access road. And back there, standing between 2 trees, was the owl. It looked farther away this time, but I could still see how big it was. It wasn't moving. It was just standing in the tree line, staring at the house. I closed the curtain and I stepped away, and that's when I knew I needed help. But I still didn't call anybody, not right away, because I was ashamed. I thought people would think I had completely lost my mind. So I spent another night alone. That was the worst night. The voice didn't stop. Sometimes it sounded like Emily was crying. Sometimes it sounded angry. Sometimes she sounded completely normal. She would say things like, "David, open the door," or "David, why won't you help me?" Or one time she said, "David, I came back for you." At one point I heard scratching on the bedroom window, and the bedroom window was on the 2nd floor. I didn't look. I could not. I just sat in the hallway with my back against the wall, and I covered my ears. But no matter how hard I pressed my hands against them, I could still hear her. By the morning, I was done. I called my brother Mark. He's 4 years older than me, and we've always been close. But I hadn't told him much about how bad things got after Emily died. I think I didn't want him worrying about me. He answered the second the phone rang. He must have knew something was wrong. He said, "David, what's going on?" And I told him everything. The voice, the owl, the face at the door, the glowing eyes. There was a long silence when I finished. Then he said, "Have you slept at all?" I said, "That's not the point." He said, "I'm not saying I don't believe you, but I could hear it in his voice." He didn't believe me. Not really. He thought I was having some kind of a breakdown. But he was very kind about it. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He just said, "I'm coming over." He got there about an hour later. The second I opened the front door, he looked shocked, because I must have looked terrible. I had not changed my clothes. I didn't shower. I probably hadn't eaten in 2 days. He came inside and looked around. Then he said, "Show me where you saw it." I told him I was not going into the backyard. He said, "David, whatever's going on, you're not going to do this alone." I kept saying no. Then he said, "Look, if there's something back there, we'll see it together. And if there isn't, maybe you can finally get some sleep." I knew what he was doing. He was trying to prove a point to me that none of this was real. But he was the only person I trusted enough to go out there with. So I agreed. He picked up the baseball bat from the kitchen floor. I remember him looking at it and saying, "You really did have a bad night, huh?" I didn't answer. We opened the back door and stepped outside. It was the early afternoon. It was bright, clear out, the kind of day where nothing bad is supposed to happen. Mark walked ahead of me. I stayed close behind him. We crossed the yard toward the oak tree. Nothing was there. We walked around the tree, nothing. Then we went closer to the fence. Mark looked into the tree line and said, "I don't see anything." I said, "It was right there." He said, "I believe that's where you saw it." Then something moved above us. I grabbed his arm. We looked up. It was a normal-sized owl. Flew out of the oak tree. Just a regular owl. It flew over the fence and disappeared into the trees. Mark watched it go. Then he looked at me. He didn't smile. He didn't want to make me feel stupid. He just said, maybe that's what you saw. I said, that is not what I saw. He said, I know. But again, he didn't. He thought the owl, the anniversary, and the lack of sleep all got mixed together in my head. And for a few minutes, I started wondering if he was right. Maybe the owl had been a normal owl the whole time. Maybe the grief had made me hear Emily's voice. Maybe the panic made the bird look bigger. I wanted that explanation, I really did. Mark suggested we get out of the house for a while. Then he asked when the last time was that I visited Emily's grave. I told him not for months. He said maybe we should go. At first, I didn't want to. Then he said maybe you need to say goodbye again. And I don't know why, but that kind of made sense to me. We barely talked during the drive. When we got to the cemetery, it was quiet. We parked and we walked over. Her gravestone was simple, just her name, the dates. I stood there for a while without saying anything. Mark stayed a few steps behind me. Then he just looked at me and he said, just say whatever you need to say. You never know, maybe it'll help. So, I did. I told her I missed her. I told her I was sorry for not visiting her more. I told her I didn't know if I was losing my mind. I even told her about the owl. I remember laughing a little bit when I said it because it sounded so ridiculous. Then I told her I loved her. I said goodbye, and honestly, at that point, I felt better. I really did. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Mark put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, it's probably time to go. We walked back to the truck. I remember thinking, maybe that's all I needed. We got into the truck and we started driving toward the cemetery entrance. We couldn't have been more than 50 yards away when I looked out the passenger side window. I don't know why I looked back, but I just did. And there was a normal-sized owl, and it was sitting on Emily's gravestone. I said, Mark, look. He slowed down and he looked through the mirror. He said, is that the same owl? I said, I don't know. The owl didn't move. It was just sitting there, looking at the truck. Then I heard Emily's voice, clear as day. It just said, David? I froze. My brother grabbed my arm so hard it actually hurt because he heard it too. He looked at me and he just yells one word, drive. I don't remember pulling out of that cemetery. I just remember looking out the window, and that's the last thing I saw. It was just sitting on top of her grave. That thing watched us leave. If you like this story, please like and subscribe for more. My name is Steven, and I'll see you next time on the next Midnight Creep Call.